Good afternoon, everybody. An educated economist here. I got this horrible lighting situation going on here, but oh well, you guys can handle it. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I wanted to make sure and get that out of the way. I hope everybody has a safe and happy holiday. Uh, my friend Tim, who emails me a lot of articles, and he calls me out every once in a while when I get things wrong, but that's okay because I deserve it. And his information that he sends me is always like prime stuff. It's really good. He's probably the reason for a lot of the topics on my channel. I have to give Tim a a thank you. He takes the time to email me, 3, 4, 5 times a week sometimes with some really awesome stuff as far as the articles, very profound stuff. Never sends me any garbage ever. Um, and he sent me this one. It was actually an essay that came out from the Federal Reserve quite a few years ago, but it's really good. It came out from the Federal Reserve History. This is where he got it from, the federalreservehistory.org, talking about the Black Monday crash of 1987. Now, a lot of people know about this crash. Like, they've heard of it, and they know that it was like the Dow Jones had lost like, 22% that day in a single day. But they're not quite aware of the events that led up to it or the things that took place after it, the events that came after it as well. Because really, this 1987 October Market Monday crash that took place, the Black Monday, it was kind of like an incident all by itself. Like, there was no war, there was no recession, it was just like this economic event that took place. So leading up, the first half of 1987 was exponential growth. The Dow had gained 44% in the first 7 months, or in the first 7 months leading up to August, right? And I guess it peaked out in August. Once a market peaks out like that, you're going to get a lot of economic news saying we're about ready to head into a downturn, because that's what happens. Anytime you have a market that has a rally of such proportions, then you're always going to have a pullback. I mean, it's just the market takes a breather. And this was no different. But the problem with this time is that it also coincided with some other events. So it goes kind of like this. The stock market began to unravel, foreshadowing the record losses that would develop a week later. Beginning on October 14th, a number of markets started incurring large daily losses. On October 16th, the rolling sell-off coincided with an event known as triple witching, which I had heard of triple witching before, but I wasn't quite aware of what that meant. I knew it had something to do with like expirations on futures, but that was it. And pretty much that's what it is. It's describes as the circumstances when monthly expirations of options and future contracts occurred on the same day. So all this stuff kind of started taking place. Like, you had this, huge run up in the stock market. Investors were getting nervous. Economic news was coming out that made the investors even more nervous. You started having a sell-off, and then and then this triple witching event took place all on the same day, and you started having a huge sell-off in the markets, and that really spooked everybody. Okay, so October 16th, the rolling sell-offs coincided with an event known as triple witching, which describes the circumstances when monthly expirations of options and future contracts occurred on the same day. October 16th, which was Friday, the Dow Jones had lost 4.6%. So now, at this point, like, the markets are incredibly nervous, but they're not like so nervous that, like this is where the big event takes place. They're just like, they're like, man, what's going on here? Over the weekend, the Treasury Secretary at the time. Oh, and there was another event. There was a bigger trade deficit than was expected. The government had announced a bigger trade deficit than expected right before the October 16th, before this Friday and all this economic news. So you can see there was a bunch of news, like things were getting very nervous at the time. Then over the weekend, before the Monday event, Treasury Secretary James Baker on Saturday, October 17th, publicly threatened to devalue the U.S. dollar in order to narrow the nation's widening trade deficit. Now, that news right there, okay, that spooked the markets. And this is where the markets really began to learn that they were intertwined. See, as time goes back, like if you take time back and you look at the individual markets from different countries and stuff, they were less intertwined. Like, the events that took place in, say, a foreign country had less impact on what was taking place in another foreign country. But then as time goes on, and even today, the more as the future comes, these markets get more intertwined and they start breathing together. Okay, so like as one market starts to churn, you realize that other markets are churning as well. Okay, and that markets aren't necessarily isolated from one another. Oh yeah, here. Okay, so come Monday morning, early Monday, live news broadcasts coming out of Asia had investors watching what was going on globally, and they were getting very freaked out. They were like, oh my gosh, the world is crashing. New Zealand stock market had a 60% drop that day. Now, Andrew Grove, chief executive of technology company Intel Corporation, said in an interview that when the markets opened up, the Dow immediately crashed. Okay, and he said it was like a theater where someone yells fire. The Dow eventually finished down 508 points. That's 22.6%. That occurred on the Monday. Everybody was just panicked. They thought, okay, it's done. Everything is over. Now, in the preceding years, coming up to this, what led the market to these highs? Now, this is something interesting. Listen to this. In the preceding years, international investors have become increasingly active in U.S. markets, accounting for some of the rapid pre-crisis appreciation in the stock prices. Very similar story to the foreign buyers of real estate that has taken place. You hear a lot of stories of that. I am really sorry about this lighting, guys. Anyway, so that's what I think about when I hear that. It was just like, wow, these foreign investors had bought up the stock market in such a way, like their markets weren't good. They didn't like it, but they loved the stock market, and you could see how fast it was growing. And so they get this like fear of missing out kind of syndrome, and they start piling into the stock market, causing it to go up even more. U.S. investment firms, now listen to this is where it really starts getting into it. U.S. investment firms, known as portfolio insurance, have become very popular. It included extensive use of options and derivatives and accelerated the crash's pace as initial losses led to further rounds of selling. So this is where they got the first taste of not only global markets feeding off of one another, where like this market's downturning, so this market's downturning, all of a sudden you realize all markets are downturning, they're all kind of breathing together, but they also got the taste of those derivatives, those insurance policies, like the credit default swaps and stuff. And this is the shadow banking system that people keep warning us about. They're saying, man, this is bigger than people realize, and that when it kicks in and it starts having this domino effect, it really starts, increasing the losses. And that's what happened back in 1987. This event changed the way a lot of regulations are occurring. And for example, the S&P stock index, if it declines 7%, 13%, or 20%, they have what they call circuit breakers, where they'll close the market down and give investors the ability to make an informed choice during periods of high market volatility. So when these markets start to crash, they'll shut the markets down. The circuit breaker will kick in, and they'll say, hey man, you investors, take a minute, think about what you're doing here, and then come back to the markets and we'll start again. And if it happens again, we're going to take another breather and we're going to wait, so that we don't have this continuous like just dropping. It gives people time to think about what they're doing. The other thing it did is it got the Federal Reserve to step in. The Federal Reserve stepped in with liquidity, right? And the Federal Reserve chairman at the time, Alan Greenspan, had this to say. The Federal Reserve, consistent with its responsibilities as the nation's central bank, affirmed today its readiness to serve as a source of liquidity to support the economic and financial system. Not too unlike what Jerome Powell has been saying today, especially with that repo market that's taken place. Very interesting stuff. Now, of course, even back then and today, people still arguing that and this is what it says here. On the other hand, some argue that the Fed's response set a precedent that had the potential to exacerbate the moral hazard. Okay. So even then they said, if you guys step in here and start protecting this market from dropping any further because of the liquidity issue, then you're going to create a situation where investors are going to know that you're going to step in and provide the liquidity that the market is needing. And if you do that, they're not going to take on the risk, or they're not going to perceive the risk, take on the thought of risk, knowing that you're going to make that pretty much a risk-free opportunity. Not necessarily risk-free, but you know what I'm saying? It's just like, when the Federal Reserve says, hey, if the problem is that you need liquidity in the market and there's a lack of liquidity and that's why the prices are dropping, then we'll provide you with all the liquidity you need. How about that? And then people are like, whoa, no worries about liquidity? Nice. That gives us a different opportunity here. We don't have this hazardous situation that we had before. And so with the Federal Reserve stepping in and doing that, it's changed the way the markets behave ever since that day. So very interesting stuff, and like I said, nothing really occurred. Like, it wasn't a war or recession or anything else. It was just this economic event that took place, but it really changed the course of history as the way markets are, like the intertwiningness of markets, the way people perceive it, the way the Federal Reserve handles things. A lot have changed after this particular event. So I'll leave a link down in the description for this. Thank you very much, Tim, for sharing that with me. And everybody have a great, happy, safe Thanksgiving. Uneducated economist, you guys let me know.